They say that some people never learn to respect boundaries, but I never expected that my mother-in-law's obsession with controlling our family would lead her to systematically poison our relationships with friends and neighbors, and ultimately drive me to orchestrate a revenge so comprehensive that it exposed her manipulative campaign and destroyed her carefully cultivated reputation in the community. My name is Timothy, and this is the story of how discovering my mother-in-law's deliberate sabotage of our social connections led me to expose her toxic behavior in the most devastating way possible. My wife Sarah and I had been married for 5 years when we moved to a new neighborhood to start fresh and build our life together. Sarah's mother, Margaret, had always been a dominant presence in our relationship, but the move to our new home seemed to intensify her need to control and manipulate every aspect of our lives. Margaret lived about 20 minutes away from our new house, which was close enough for frequent visits but far enough that we had hoped to establish some independence and privacy. However, Margaret quickly made it clear that she considered our new neighborhood to be an extension of her territory and our neighbors to be people she needed to manage and influence. From the beginning, Margaret inserted herself into our efforts to build relationships with our neighbors. She would arrive unannounced during neighborhood gatherings, introduce herself as Sarah's mother, and immediately begin sharing personal information about our family that we had not intended to disclose. She seemed to view our neighbors as an audience for her opinions and a source of validation for her role as the family matriarch. Initially, I thought Margaret's behavior was simply the result of enthusiasm about our new home and her desire to help us integrate into the community. I assumed that her involvement would decrease over time as we became more established and she became more comfortable with our independence. However, as months passed, I began to notice that Margaret's interactions with our neighbors were becoming increasingly problematic. She would contradict things that Sarah and I had said, share embarrassing stories about our marriage, and offer unsolicited advice about how we should be managing our household and our relationships. Most concerning of all, Margaret began to position herself as the primary source of information about our family, encouraging neighbors to contact her directly if they had questions or concerns about us. She gave out her phone number freely and suggested that she was more reliable and accessible than we were. I also noticed that Margaret had a particular talent for identifying and exploiting tensions or disagreements within our neighborhood. She would listen carefully to complaints or concerns that neighbors shared, and then she would amplify and spread these issues in ways that created conflict and division among the people we were trying to build relationships with. Margaret seemed to thrive on drama and controversy, and she had a remarkable ability to insert herself into disputes and disagreements in ways that made situations worse rather than better. She would take sides in neighborhood conflicts, share confidential information that had been told to her in private, and generally create an atmosphere of mistrust and suspicion. The most troubling aspect of Margaret's behavior was that she seemed to be deliberately undermining Sarah's and my efforts to build positive relationships with our neighbors. She would contradict our plans, criticize our decisions in front of other people, and generally present herself as the more reasonable and reliable member of our family. When I tried to discuss these concerns with Sarah, she initially defended her mother and suggested that I was being too sensitive about Margaret's involvement in our social life. Sarah had grown up with Margaret's controlling behavior and had learned to accept it as normal, so she didn't immediately recognize how damaging it was to our relationships with other people. However, as more time passed, even Sarah began to notice that our relationships with neighbors were becoming strained and difficult. People who had initially been friendly and welcoming began to seem distant and uncomfortable around us. Invitations to social events became less frequent, and conversations with neighbors became more superficial and guarded. I decided to pay closer attention to Margaret's interactions with our neighbors to understand what was happening and why our social relationships were deteriorating. What I discovered was shocking and revealed the extent of Margaret's systematic campaign to isolate and control us. Margaret had been telling different neighbors different versions of stories about our marriage, our finances, and our personal lives. She would share confidential information that Sarah had told her in private, and she would embellish and distort these stories in ways that made us appear unreliable, irresponsible, or dishonest. Most damaging of all, Margaret had been actively spreading rumors and gossip about us that were designed to damage our reputation and credibility in the neighborhood. She would suggest that we were having financial problems, that our marriage was unstable, or that we were not trustworthy neighbors. Margaret had also been positioning herself as the victim of our supposed mistreatment, telling neighbors that we were ungrateful, disrespectful, and unwilling to accept her help and guidance. She would present herself as a concerned mother who was trying to help her daughter and son-in-law despite their resistance to her involvement. The most insidious aspect of Margaret's campaign was that she was using her age and her status as Sarah's mother to gain credibility and sympathy from our neighbors. People naturally assumed that she was a reliable source of information about our family, and they were inclined to believe her version of events over ours. I realized that Margaret's behavior was not simply the result of poor social skills or excessive enthusiasm. She was deliberately and systematically sabotaging our relationships with our neighbors as a way of maintaining control over our lives and ensuring that we remained dependent on her for social connection and support. Margaret's strategy was sophisticated and effective. By isolating us from our neighbors and damaging our reputation in the community, she was making it more difficult for us to build the independent social network that would allow us to establish boundaries with her and reduce her influence over our lives. I decided that Margaret needed to face consequences for her toxic behavior and that our neighbors needed to understand the truth about what she had been doing. I wanted to expose her manipulative campaign and restore our reputation in the community. The plan I developed was designed to document Margaret's lies and manipulation, gather evidence of her systematic sabotage of our relationships, and expose her behavior to the people she had been deceiving. I wanted her to lose the credibility and influence she had been using to damage our lives. Phase 1 involved carefully documenting Margaret's interactions with our neighbors, including recording conversations where possible and gathering evidence of the contradictory stories she was telling different people. I wanted to create a comprehensive record of her lies and manipulation. Phase 2 involved reaching out to neighbors individually to understand what Margaret had been telling them about us and to gather evidence of the rumors and gossip she had been spreading. I wanted to document the full scope of her campaign against us. Phase 3 involved confronting Margaret with evidence of her behavior and giving her an opportunity to acknowledge what she had been doing and to make amends for the damage she had caused. Phase 4 involved exposing Margaret's behavior to our neighbors and the broader community, sharing the evidence I had gathered and explaining how she had been manipulating and deceiving people. The final phase involved establishing clear boundaries with Margaret and ensuring that she could no longer interfere with our relationships or damage our reputation in the community. The investigation phase took several weeks, during which I carefully documented Margaret's visits to our neighborhood and her interactions with our neighbors. I was able to record several conversations where she contradicted things that Sarah and I had said, and where she shared confidential information that she had no right to disclose. I also reached out to neighbors individually to understand what Margaret had been telling them about us. What I discovered was even worse than I had suspected. Margaret had been telling elaborate lies about our marriage, our finances, and our character, and she had been encouraging neighbors to be suspicious and distrustful of us. Most shocking of all, I learned that Margaret had been actively trying to turn our neighbors against us by suggesting that we were dangerous, unstable, or untrustworthy. She had been using fear and suspicion as tools to isolate us and damage our relationships. The evidence I gathered was comprehensive and undeniable. I had recordings of Margaret's lies, witness statements from neighbors who had been deceived by her, and documentation of the contradictory stories she had been telling different people. The confrontation with Margaret happened on a Sunday afternoon in March, exactly 8 months after we had moved to our new neighborhood. I had arranged to meet with her privately to discuss her behavior and to give her an opportunity to acknowledge what she had been doing. Instead of the defensive denial I expected, Margaret initially tried to justify her behavior by claiming that she was protecting Sarah and me from neighbors who were not trustworthy or reliable. She suggested that her lies and manipulation had been necessary to shield us from people who might take advantage of us. But when I presented her with specific evidence of her lies and the damage she had caused, Margaret's justifications became increasingly desperate and contradictory. She could not explain why she had told different neighbors different versions of the same stories, or why she had shared confidential information that Sarah had told her in private. When Margaret realized that her justifications were not credible, she changed tactics and tried to minimize the significance of her behavior. She suggested that her lies had been harmless and that any damage to our relationships was the result of our own social awkwardness rather than her interference. But I was not interested in Margaret's attempts to avoid responsibility for her toxic behavior. She had deliberately and systematically sabotaged our relationships with our neighbors, and she needed to face the consequences of her actions. I told Margaret that I planned to expose her behavior to our neighbors and to the broader community, and that I would be sharing the evidence I had gathered about her lies and manipulation. I wanted her to understand that her campaign against us had been discovered and documented. Margaret was devastated to learn that her behavior would be exposed and that she would lose the credibility and influence she had been using to control our lives. She begged me to handle the matter privately and suggested that she would stop interfering with our relationships if I agreed not to share the evidence with other people. But I had already made the decision that Margaret's behavior needed to be exposed and that our neighbors needed to understand the truth about what she had been doing. Her manipulation had been too extensive and damaging for me to consider a private resolution. The exposure of Margaret's behavior was swift and comprehensive. I shared the evidence I had gathered with our neighbors, including recordings of her lies and documentation of the contradictory stories she had been telling different people. I also organized a neighborhood meeting where I presented a detailed account of Margaret's campaign against us, including specific examples of her lies and manipulation. I wanted everyone to understand how they had been deceived and how Margaret had been using them as tools in her effort to control and isolate us. The reaction from our neighbors was one of shock and anger as they realized how they had been manipulated and deceived. People who had believed Margaret's lies felt betrayed and embarrassed, and they were furious to learn that they had been used as weapons in her campaign against us. Most importantly, the exposure of Margaret's behavior completely destroyed her credibility and influence in our community. People who had previously respected her as a concerned mother and reliable source of information now saw her as a manipulative liar who could not be trusted. The neighborhood meeting also served as an opportunity for our neighbors to share their own experiences with Margaret's manipulation and to understand how she had been playing them against each other. Many people realized that Margaret had been spreading rumors and creating conflicts throughout the neighborhood, not just targeting Sarah and me. The most satisfying aspect of Margaret's downfall was watching her realize that her campaign of lies and manipulation had ultimately achieved the opposite of what she had intended. Instead of isolating us and maintaining control over our lives, her behavior had exposed her true character and destroyed her reputation in the community. Margaret had thought she was being clever by using our neighbors as tools in her effort to control us, but she had failed to consider that her lies would eventually be discovered and that people would be angry to learn how they had been deceived and manipulated. The aftermath of the exposure was decisive and comprehensive. Margaret's reputation in our neighborhood and the broader community was completely destroyed, and she was no longer able to interfere with our relationships or influence our social connections. Our neighbors, who had previously been distant and suspicious because of Margaret's lies, became supportive and apologetic once they understood the truth. Many people reached out to express their regret for believing Margaret's stories and to rebuild the relationships that her manipulation had damaged. Most importantly, Sarah finally understood the extent of her mother's toxic behavior and the damage it had been causing to our marriage and our social life. The evidence I had gathered made it impossible for Sarah to continue defending Margaret or minimizing the significance of her actions. Sarah and I were able to establish clear boundaries with Margaret, including restrictions on her visits to our neighborhood and her interactions with our neighbors. We made it clear that any future attempts to interfere with our relationships or spread lies about us would result in complete estrangement. The experience taught me valuable lessons about the importance of recognizing and confronting manipulative behavior, even when it comes from family members. I learned that toxic people can use their relationships and their perceived authority to cause tremendous damage to other people's lives. Looking back on this experience, I am proud of the way I handled the discovery of Margaret's campaign against us. I could have confronted her immediately when I first became suspicious, but instead I took the time to gather comprehensive evidence that exposed the full scope of her manipulation. The neighborhood that Margaret had tried to turn against us became a source of support and friendship once the truth was revealed. People who had been deceived by her lies became allies in our effort to build the independent social life that she had been trying to prevent. Margaret's campaign of lies and manipulation had been interconnected crimes against our marriage, our social relationships, and our community. She had been willing to deceive and manipulate innocent people as tools in her effort to control and isolate us. The revenge I orchestrated against Margaret was comprehensive and devastating, but it was also necessary to protect our interests and restore our reputation in the community. She had chosen to build her control on lies and manipulation, and she had to face the full consequences of her choices. The recordings and evidence that had documented Margaret's lies had also provided the proof needed to expose her behavior and hold her accountable. The irony was not lost on me that the very neighbors she had tried to turn against us had become the witnesses to her manipulation. In the end, Margaret's elaborate campaign had achieved the opposite of what she had intended. Instead of isolating us and maintaining control over our lives, her lies had ultimately cost her all credibility and influence, and had resulted in complete estrangement from our family. The most important outcome of this entire experience was that Sarah and I were able to reclaim our social life and our community relationships from Margaret's web of lies and manipulation. We were no longer living under the shadow of her toxic influence, and we were free to build genuine relationships based on honesty and mutual respect. The evidence that had exposed Margaret's campaign served as a reminder that manipulative behavior ultimately leaves traces that can be discovered and documented. Her careful planning and elaborate lies had ultimately been no match for thorough investigation and community awareness. Margaret learned that campaigns built on lies and manipulation come with consequences that extend far beyond the immediate control they are meant to provide. She lost her relationships, her reputation, and her standing in the community. She discovered that the trust and respect of her family and community, once broken through systematic deception, could not be easily repaired or replaced. Her manipulation had destroyed not just our relationships, but also her connections with people who had previously respected and trusted her. The revenge was complete, the truth was exposed, and we were finally free to build a new social life based on the values of honesty and integrity that Margaret had abandoned. I had won not just a personal victory in exposing her behavior, but a community victory that protected other people from her manipulation. Looking forward, I carried with me the lessons I had learned about the importance of recognizing manipulative behavior, the dangers of allowing toxic people to control social relationships, and the need to investigate suspicious patterns rather than accepting explanations at face value. The experience had been emotionally damaging and socially disruptive, but it had also been educational and ultimately liberating. I had learned that I was capable of handling systematic manipulation with strategic thinking and community action, and I had proven to myself that I would not tolerate toxic behavior even when it came from family members. Margaret's story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of using lies and manipulation to control other people, and about the way that toxic behavior ultimately destroys not just the relationships it is meant to control, but the character and reputation of the people who choose deception over honesty. Her downfall served as a reminder that exploiting family relationships and community trust for personal control is ultimately unsustainable and self-destructive, and that manipulative behavior ultimately destroys not just the relationships it is meant to preserve, but the standing and credibility of the people who choose manipulation over genuine connection. The neighborhood relationships that had been meant to represent our integration into the community had instead become the battlefield where Margaret's manipulation was exposed and defeated. In the end, the revenge was not just about exposing Margaret's lies or restoring our reputation. It was about vindicating the principles of honesty, community trust, and family respect that she had abandoned, and about proving that manipulative behavior will ultimately be discovered and punished. The social life that Margaret had tried to destroy through her lies and manipulation was replaced by a new understanding of what genuine community relationships should look like, built on transparency, mutual respect, and shared commitment to honesty in all interactions. Her betrayal had been devastating, but it had also been educational, and I was determined to use those lessons to build better relationships in the future based on the values that truly mattered to our family and our community. Margaret's campaign of lies and manipulation, and the elaborate deception she had constructed to control our lives, had ultimately cost her everything that should have mattered to her: her family relationships, her reputation, and her standing in the community. The recordings and evidence that exposed her manipulation and the witness statements that documented her lies served as permanent reminders that truth has a way of revealing itself, no matter how carefully people try to hide their deception behind family authority and community involvement. The revenge was complete, justice was served, and we were finally free to move forward with our lives, knowing that I had handled one of the most sophisticated forms of family manipulation with dignity, strategic thinking, and unwavering commitment to truth and community accountability.